Today we're going to be discussing, should you tell people about your goals, your dreams, your projects, or should you keep them to yourself? For those of you new here, hi, I'm Pam, and I enjoy exploring the everyday decisions that shape our lives. We'll have some personal anecdotes, and we'll also explore what the research has to say. Let's jump in. Okay, let's start out this concept with a slightly embarrassing story from earlier this year. I recently have been starting to get more involved in environmental efforts. This has started pretty gradually, just going to some events. I've only recently started volunteering. It's all pretty new. And through part of this, I wanted more education. However, going to graduate school, we know, is extremely expensive, and I don't even know if I would even do anything with this professionally or if it's just a cause I want to contribute to. And so I found that MIT has some open courseware where you can have access to the syllabi, the lectures, sometimes even in this case for the course I found the textbook was even free and available online, which is amazing to be able to access this information for free online. I got so excited about it when I started taking a class called Urban Energy Systems and Policy. Even just a few days in, I was getting pretty proud of myself for doing this in my free time after work rather than watching TV. And I also was just so excited that this information was readily available online. So I told one of my clients who's an architect and some of her work pertains to this. I told my partner, I told my mom, and I think one other person, maybe a friend. Now, shortly after telling all of these people, I stopped logging in after work to read about this and watch the lectures. It sort of fizzled out. Now, where the story ends, we don't know. I may return to it down the line. I may never go back to it. I may find other ways to learn or contribute, but that's not the point. This brings up the question, should we share our goals to get support, or do we keep an idea to ourselves because that might actually make us more likely to achieve it? I think that we all can relate to this. Maybe you're really excited about some idea you had for a business or an art project. We have all this initial enthusiasm. We often don't take it past this initial excitement. In a great, quick 3-minute TED Talk by Sivers, he talks about findings from research that point to the fact that when we talk about our goals, we often get a reward. For example, telling those people that I was taking this course, I often got a, "Oh wow, that's so great," back. And that probably felt like a little reward. Even though I hadn't done much, I'd only logged in probably 3 days after work, probably put in no more than 6 hours collectively, maybe less. I recommend watching this video. It's great. I'll link it down below and it's really fast. But I do want to pull out one quote that he said here. When you tell someone about your goal and they acknowledge it, psychologists have called this a social reality. The mind is tricked into feeling that it is already done. And then because of that self-satisfaction, you are less motivated to do the hard work that is necessary. So in my example, in Sivers' perspective, with each person that I was telling, I was getting these rewards and it felt as if I was already moving further towards this goal than I actually was, which made me less likely to log on each day and read the accessible but somewhat dense at times textbook, Sustainable Energy Without Hot Air. Again, amazing that that's free online, but I didn't do much with it. This is connected to the idea of intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation. When we do something because we're intrinsically motivated, it's because we want to do it out of enjoyment or something that's coming from the inside. When we're doing something because we're extrinsically motivated, it means we're motivated by something on the outside, like a reward, such as recognition or money. And sometimes extrinsic motivation gets a bad rap. It's completely normal sometimes to want to do something because of an extrinsic reward. In fact, for the majority of us, that's a necessity. Think of going to work in exchange for money. But when it comes to something that we were motivated for intrinsically, and then we start getting an external reward, like for instance, maybe an artist who starts getting a paycheck, sometimes that can then change their relationship to it. A classic example of that was a study by Mark Lepper in 1973. I can link something that discusses it down below, but children that were doing an activity that they enjoyed intrinsically, such as playing with a certain toy or drawing, then if they started getting an expected reward at a certain interval, then that reward went away, they would often stop doing that same activity because it's like, hey, where did my cookie go? I don't actually know what the rewards were, but this is connected to that. We're getting these extrinsic rewards of, oh my goodness, that's so great that you're doing that. And even if people don't say it, even if we just feel good having like posted it online, we're getting these rewards, from dopamine to, if we want to look at social psychology, that validation of how we're being looked at by others. Now, let's go into some exceptions for this because, first of all, I'm so impressed how Sivers even fit in a lot of history in this 3-minute TED Talk. He even went through history and different times where this was being realized, that talking about our goals might actually make us less likely to achieve them. But because it was only 3 minutes, by its very nature, that's going to be bite-sized, and it has to lack nuance. It has to pack a punch and just get at a certain point. Here, because we have a little bit more time, we can unpack some nuance of when does this not apply. There are quite a few studies that point to accountability and social support actually helping with our goals, which he even kind of goes into in the TED Talk, that, conventional wisdom is that telling other people holds us accountable. So that's why we often do that. But then some studies actually do back that up. I think that one key in a lot of these studies is that it often depends on if you're actually getting accountability from the people that you're telling, or if they're people that you're telling in passing. That's something that I saw if you kind of zoom out, and it makes sense. If you're working with a personal trainer, that's what I do for work. Obviously, those people need to tell us our goals, or we can't help them achieve them. If you're writing a book, you need to talk to your editor or your writers group about your goals for that book because it's going to impact the process. If you have a friend that you hold each other accountable for goals, that's part of what you do. Maybe you go for walks every couple weeks, and part of your friendship is holding each other accountable for goals. I find that different than just catching up over coffee. Maybe you're talking about relationships, you're talking about politics, you're talking about what you're reading, and then you just casually mention some goal you're working towards or some thing you're really excited about that's really not well baked. It's in the early phases. And then it's fleeting, you get the little reward, you move on. That's different than someone that's in your corner actually helping to keep pulling you along, part of the mechanism that provides momentum for you besides that internal motivation. So that would be one exception. One other example is that social movements and connection can help with investing into something that we care about. Think about marches or petitions or gathering with people that care about like-minded things. A lot of this ties into what a lot of people have been speaking about lately in the psychology and self-development space about identity. The more you identify with something like a certain cause, the more you talk about doing it, the more you invest into it, the more actions you take, the more people you're around that do it, you start to build this identity as caring about something. For instance, even starting to talk about environmental efforts on this channel, even starting to talk about it with my friends, starting to meet other people that care about that, starting to read those books, you start to be tied to a social framework of other people that care about it too. And that can pull you along like a current because, okay, I set up composting where I live, and now the people that I live with are also starting to compost, so that if I forget to pick up new compost bags or something, they will. That's the whole reason that this is even counterintuitive in the first place, to not tell our goals to people, is because the thought is that other people help us. And there is some truth to that. I can link some additional studies down below for further reading, but I think that right now we're just acknowledging that, like, hey, some of the research points both ways. So yes, while research points to one side of this argument, there's also some interesting research on the other side as well. And while we're going back and forth with the pros and cons of this, let's circle back to the idea that telling some people about our goals is helpful, although we don't want to announce it too broadly too soon. So while telling your boss or your writers group or your coach about your goals, maybe we don't tell everyone. Maybe we have an inner circle of people that we tell. So for instance, maybe you're not telling every coworker you work with about your long-term vision at that company, which would be kind of weird to do anyway. And going along with keeping some things to ourselves, at least in certain circles, this also protects us when ideas are half-baked or not fully formed. When something is half-baked, like an idea, you can give it room to grow and pivot and evolve into what it's meant to be. I know often when I've told people about creative projects a little bit too early, I've almost shaped them into what I think that other person wants. And yes, we should test early in the marketplace. We should get feedback from people, but telling people too early can almost freeze the idea in a certain space without giving it room and to grow. If you did it in the very safe place of solitude or 1 to 2 other people that are extremely open-minded and supportive, they give it room to grow into what it's meant to be. That might not make a lot of sense if you haven't done something creative, and creative doesn't just have to be art. It could be coming up with a business idea, anything, but anything where you really need to tap into what's deep inside of you and trust it versus trying to mold it into what others expect of it. That can come later in editing where you refine it. We don't want to edit ourselves prematurely. And so here I think we're developing two frameworks for this. One, we have a circle of who we're telling. There's certain things we might keep to ourselves. There's certain things that we might tell sort of an inner circle at first. And then at a certain phase, we will tell a wider circle. For instance, if you were training for a marathon, sure, if you're very early on in the process, maybe you don't announce it extremely publicly because you would get that social reward. Also, you don't even really know if this is something that you want to do. By the time you get up to 8 miles, you might decide that you don't really want to do this. And then you've already told people, so then you might keep training because you don't want the embarrassment of backing out, but then that goes down to, okay, well, now you're not even intrinsically motivated. We're only extrinsically motivated, which really has proven to not be that. I really like the book Drive by Daniel Pink on this. I know that there's people always love to push back in the research world. So people often like push back and like, well, no, here's where external motivation can be helpful. Yes, it is. But there's so much to be said for internal motivation, and it's so much quieter and it comes from the inside. And I think that that's where the pushes towards that really come from, because the world obviously tells us what it finds valuable, but what you find valuable deep down, that's a lot harder to hear and often very important. And now, anyway, going back to this marathon example, eventually some people will find out. They're going to see you running. You're not going to try to keep it secret forever. But by that point, you're already pretty invested in it. And in fact, as you get closer to doing the marathon and more people have found out, maybe you've passed that tipping point of the highest peak on the mountain of difficulty. And so at this point, other people finding out about it could be helpful. They might ask about it as it gets closer. And this is where I think that little bit of social pressure can be good. I'll give you an example where telling people at the perfect time, at least for me, I think was really helpful. So I really wanted to write a book in my 20s about human behavior and decision making. It's what I studied in school. It was the specific specialty within psychology that I studied, and I really loved it. As I got into my later 20s, I realized, most of my work experience is in the fitness industry, so I probably could write a much more specific book that has more practical takeaways if I write this through the lens of decision making within nutrition and exercise. So I had so many stop and go moments with writing different versions of this book, from when it was just psychology to then adding in fitness. And I probably started it, I don't know, in earnest, maybe a dozen times, in just writing different introductions or first chapters, maybe 100. It was pretty wild. But the time that I actually finished it was a time that I didn't tell anyone. I had a certain angle I was going to approach the book through, and I just cranked out within a few months, a couple hours a day, a first draft. After the first draft, I told people that where I was at it. And I didn't announce it broadly. I didn't announce it on social media. Then I was telling the people I was closest to. I worked with an editing team, got it more refined as it was close to the third, fourth. I think when it was on the fourth draft and about to go to my editors is when I posted it on social media. And that was a great time, because those edits, I was sometimes getting like 6,000 tracking changes back from my editors. It was hard. And so by that point, other people knowing, like even acquaintances, maybe at the gym just asking me, oh, how's the book going? That actually helped pull me across the line, but it met some certain criteria. A, I'd already done the hardest part before it was public. B, there were people helping me that were on my team that I had told helping with that momentum. C, it was something I intrinsically, authentically wanted to do. It had passed that test. And then D, that social pressure of, ugh, I've told people about this, I better follow through. That was only 5%. It was not the main reason I was doing it, was for some social reward. So another caveat or takeaway could be, it depends on how far you are into the project. For instance, in the very early phase, maybe you keep it just to yourself. That allows for flexibility. It allows for you to do some of the hardest parts before you're telling people. Then in a middle stage, you tell a few people, an inner circle of people that will be actively helping support you. And then in the later stages, you might announce it more broadly, and this can help give you that last 5% when it's about sustaining the momentum you've already built. And some of that can come from a larger community outside, I think. So Lastly, do I think that telling people about that MIT course made me not finish it? I think about 40% yes. I think 60% of it is that the systems I had in place. I was doing it after work. I'd usually start around 9 p.m. I was usually pretty tired. I could have done it after work a bit earlier. I did not have the habits built. I'd only done it a few days when I was telling people. So, yes, telling people gave me a bit of a social reward, but I think that that was not the full picture of why I didn't continue. And that's why behavior change is so complicated. I think people like to boil it down to one or two factors when it is multifactorial indeed. So, on the idea of if you should tell people about your goal, project, or dreams, it depends. There's some nuance, and I hope that this gave you some mental frameworks that you can think about next time you're on the fence about that. And it's about being aware and finding what works for us too. So on this topic, what works for you? I'd love to hear from you. You can send a voice message in on the SpeakPipe link down below or write in, and I might include your message in a future episode. And either way, I'd love to hear from you. I'd also like to hear from you in the comments. If this was helpful, sharing it with a friend is a great way to support the show, as is leaving a review, written or even just tapping a star rating on Apple or Spotify. See you next Monday, and thank you for being here.